Good morning. This Sunday we're going to be in Jonah. And so let me just kind of walk you through the text. I'm not going to take time to read it just because I think you're familiar with the text, as it's a kind of common story. But there's a couple of unique aspects of the text that kind of help us to know what the author is seeking to communicate to us. And so one of the things that you'll notice as you look at the text is the verbs. Okay, and so there's the verb that's initially used, the command that the Lord gives to Jonah in verse 2, arise, go to Nineveh. And then what you'll notice as the text continues is it constantly describes Jonah not as arising. Jonah never arises. In fact, what you see him doing is constantly descending. So you'll see that he then arose, but what does he do? He actually he flees to Tarshish, and then he pays the fare, and then he goes down into the boat, and then ultimately he actually ends up inside the ocean, right? Um, and so there's this call for him to do this. He's constantly running from that call because he's afraid of the mercy of God. And because he's afraid of the mercy of God, he chooses not to follow the Lord in obedience. He chooses instead to pursue his own selfish ambition, his own selfish desires. And even when the captain of the ship comes to him and says, "Hey, what are you doing? What do you mean, sleeper? Arise, call on your God." Does he arise then? No, he still does not arise. You have the pagan people who are supposed to be the unbelievers, who don't know the Lord, who don't know his goodness, his mercy, his kindness, who are calling upon the Lord, who they don't even know who they're calling on. They're just calling on whichever God they can find, right? And they're seeking God's mercy. And then you have this individual who knows of God's mercy, but he's afraid for God to show his mercy. And because he's selfish with God's mercy and he doesn't want God to extend that mercy, he refuses to even come up and pray. You have the interaction with them where they realize who he is, or they're beginning to realize who he is, and they ask him a series of 5 questions, and he only answers by answering really 2 of the questions. They come to him for what causes this trouble, what is your occupation, and where do you come from, and what's your country, and of what people are you? And he just answers and he says he's a Hebrew and he fears the Lord. Well, that's really an interesting thing because the idea of fear has been predominant throughout the text. And as you look at it, the mariners are they're fearful, and so they're fearful of the waves. They're fearful with a great fear. And ultimately, what happens as the text concludes in Jonah chapter 1 is they actually become fearful of the Lord with a great fear. And so if you go to verse 16, then the men feared the Lord exceedingly and offered a sacrifice to the Lord and took vows. All right. So the one who professes to fear the Lord doesn't actually fear the Lord. The ones who should not actually know about the Lord and fear the Lord actually end up fearing the Lord. Ultimately, everybody showed mercy. God is not stopped by your lack of obedience and my lack of obedience. God accomplishes purposes. He uses even disobedience to show his mercy, to show his goodness. Jonah is so dissatisfied with the idea of God extending mercy that he's willing actually for the Lord to just kill him, right? He's like, well, I'm going to run away and not accomplish the task that you've given me. Well, the Lord doesn't allow him to run away. And when that doesn't work, what does he say? Well, if that's not going to work, then just throw me overboard and let me die. There's no thought in Jonah's mind in chapter 1 at all about turning to the Lord in repentance and saying, I'm wrong, I've sinned against you, I'll go to Nineveh, I'll preach your message. That's completely out of Jonah's thoughts. He has no concern, no care for the mercy of God. And so it's really building us and preparing us for the final question. And so what the book of Jonah, I think, is doing is it's leading us ultimately to think through in our own hearts the question at the very end of the book. Well, let me give you a little bit of context. But the Lord said, you have had pity on the plant for which you have not labored, nor made it grow, which came up in a night and perished in a night, should I not pity Nineveh, that great city, in which there are more than 120,000 people who cannot discern between their right hand and their left, and much livestock? And so, what's our heart like? Are we people who love the mercy of God that's been extended to us? Are we people who love the truth that God is a merciful God and wants to extend that mercy to others? Or are we like Jonah? And so that's the question that I think ultimately you and I need to wrestle with as we think through the book. You'll be receiving a lot of questions. A lot of them are just kind of questions for contemplation, so I didn't provide a lot of commentary on them. Answers will differ between individuals. All right, we'll see you Sunday.